Hi everyone and welcome. I'm going to talk about a lot of fun stuff today, but first I want to cover a little bit of mechanics. First of all, I'm your host today. My name is Joe Brady, and I'm here to talk about perfect color and perfect exposure together. So what I'm here to talk about today are two tools that every photographer should have. First is a meter. I've got a Sekonic.478 DR here in my hand. Perfect exposure, and once you learn how to use it, you won't be able to do a shoot without it. I don't go anywhere and do any serious shooting without having a handheld meter, and I'll explain why in a minute. The next piece is the X-Rite Color Checker Passport. This little device gives you a reference and the ability to create custom color profiles for your camera so that all your colors are going to snap into place even under mixed lighting condition. Now, I've talked about both of these devices before, but never together. Now there is a big reason to do so. But let's do a quick overview of the two pieces first. Now, I mentioned light meter. I don't do a shoot without a light meter. The reason is a meter like this Sekonic meter, provides instant readings to the light falling on the subject. For example, if I wanted to take a light meter reading of myself, I can just come here and take a reading. The problem with doing it with a camera, whether you are a studio shooter, a portrait shooter, ambient light, or a landscape shooter, is your camera is going to give you a different value depending on where it's pointing. As sophisticated as cameras are, they don't know what's important in the scene to you, and they just measure reflective light. So if you're pointing at something dark, or something dark is in the middle of the frame, that's going to influence the exposure, and you're going to end up with something overexposed because your camera is looking to make everything sort of a middle gray. That's how light meters work. The beauty of having a handheld meter is it's only measuring the light falling on the subject. Doesn't care what color clothing I'm wearing, doesn't care about the color of my hair or the color of the background. It's simply measuring the light hitting me. Same thing for a landscape. If I'm photographing a mountain that's 5 miles away, it's still the same sun that's illuminating it. In that case, I'll just take a reading like this, get my number, put that in the camera, and I'm done. My exposure is going to be perfect, not influenced by any color or contrast in the scene. Now the next piece, and I've believed in this since the first day I had one, I can't imagine you not having this available. The Color Checker Passport has all the tools necessary to give you consistent and accurate color, pretty much enter any light source. If you're a wedding shooter, again, a portrait shooter, or a landscape shooter, it gives you a color standard. You've got all of these patches, and the software knows what the values of them should be. Everything will snap into place once you apply the profile, and I'm going to show you that today both in Lightroom and in Photoshop. It also gives you the ability to do a custom white balance either on the studio, in the field, or in software with the white balance target here. Now, something new is this has an additional target. This is the Sekonic version of the Color Checker Passport. It's added a gray card for doing gray reflective readings with the spot meter, which you're going to see in just a minute. And that's the exciting part of what's going on today. Together, these two pieces are better than the sum of their parts. They can work together. What you can now do is actually calibrate your meter to your camera. This is done using a combination of Sekonic's free DTS software and the Color Checker. So what this means is you can create what's called an exposure profile for your camera. You have to understand that your cameras have some variability. Every camera has a different idea, really, of what middle gray is. Also, different cameras have different tonal ranges, different dynamic ranges, the ability to capture light. Your meter out of the box doesn't know that. By creating this calibration exposure profile, now the meter knows exactly what your camera is capable of and what it thinks middle gray is. So the process is started by taking shots of the targets with different exposure values. So let's go through that process, and by the way, again, use the chat room. When we come back, I'll take some questions. Let's go ahead and capture the images and the readings that we need for the DTS software so that we can calibrate the meter to the camera. I'm using a Sony Alpha 99 right here. I've got my Sekonic X-Rite Color Checker Passport with the gray target up here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to take both an ambient and a spot reading off of the gray card. So I'm just using studio lights here. They're about 3200K, which reminds me, when you start your shooting, since we're going to be putting JPEGs into the software, you do want to make sure that your white balance is set correctly. What I did was I did a custom white balance before we started. Good idea. If you're shooting raw, you can do it in post and then just export your JPEGs with that white balance. It just makes it easier if you just have it all set up front. So I'm going to take my reading here, and what you kind of want to go at is get a reading that is going to come in at f8 at whatever settings you're at. Now I'm at ISO 400. I picked something that's going to give me kind of a broad range. I'm at a 30th of a second, and I can take a look at my reading, and I have f8 and 1/10. You also want to make sure that your meter is set in tenths of a stop increments. A lot of times it's common to have these set in a third stop, which is what I do when I'm out in the field because that's what my camera does. But for the DTS software, I do want to be in tenths of a stop because that's going to allow me to calibrate the incident reader to the spot reader. So again, I've got 8 and 1/10. So I'm going to remove the dome on the meter, and I'm going to put on the spot reading attachment. Here's the spot attachment for the 478 meter. Now it's an optional accessory, and you don't have to have it to do this calibration of the meter to the camera. It will also serve the purpose of calibrating the meter when you're doing both incident and spot readings. So we're going to go ahead and take advantage of that. However, if you don't have this attachment, that's okay. What we're going to do when we get to the software is when it asks for the readings of the spot and the incident readings, we would just put the same numbers in. But since we had it, we're going to go ahead and do it just so you can see the process should you decide you want one of these. Now what I can do is actually look through here and take a reading. Since I'm right up against this, I'm just going to take a reading right here, and I get f8 and 2/10. So they're 1/10 of a stop off. You need to remember those numbers, so you might want to write them down. So I had f8 with 1/10 for my incident reading, f8 with 2/10 for my reflective reading. So that's the first numbers we want to know about. As a side note, this is the little pouch that the spot meter attachment comes in. So if you frequent medieval fairs, you could use it as a change purse and just have it hanging right next to your codpiece. So have at it. Now that I've got my readings for the incident light and the reflective light using the spot meter attachment, now it's time for me to take photographs of the color checker passport with the camera. And what I want to do is, I'm going to use the same number that I used for my incident reading. So I had f8 and 1/10. Well, my camera doesn't do 1/10, so I'm going to set my camera at f8 at a 30th of a second at 400 ISO. I'm going to take that shot, that will be my middle. Then I need to take two others. I need to take 3 stops open and 3 stops closed from that. So that's why f8 is a good starting point, particularly if you have a 2.8 lens, because 2.8 will be 3 stops open and f22 will be 3 stops closed. So that would be my 3 shots, f8, 2.8, and f22, all at 400 ISO at a 30th of a second. So let's go ahead and get those shots done. All right, so now I've got my color checker target sitting on my little stand. It's in exactly the same place, so I know again I'm going to be at f8. So I'm going to take my 3 shots. Remember, I've also already custom white balanced. I'm going to take my f8, my 2.8, and my f22 exposure to then bring into the software. By taking these 3 exposures, what's going to happen is the software is going to be able to then see where the clipping points are happening. So it's going to learn the actual tonal range of the sensor. By doing this, what happens is the meter learns how the camera sensor records light. It learns to know what the camera thinks f8 is. It also learns what the complete tonal range of the sensor is, so that when I then take multiple readings later, I can see right on the meter exactly where they fall and if they were all within the dynamic range of my sensor. And if not, then it gives me a warning to let me know you've got some part of the image outside of your range of capture, so you're going to have to do something about that. So let's go ahead and take these files now that we're done, and we're going to load them into the software and put them to work. All right, I see you guys are taking advantage of the chat room, so good job. And you've got a lot of good questions coming in, and a couple of them are appropriate right now, so let's answer that. First of all, someone asked a specific metering question. A little beyond the breadth today, that's coming up, but the question was, if you have a backlit item, how do you measure for that? There's some metering that becomes subjective, and it depends on what is important in the image. If I've got something that's a backlit, say it's a face, and what's important is the face be correctly exposed, then I'm going to meter in this direction back to the camera so that I have a reading for the face. That would blow out the background in a backlit situation. If I maybe have someone looking off to the side and I've just got a little bit of rim light here, then what I'll probably do is measure here. This dome that you see on the top of the meter is designed to simulate a 3-dimensional object. So if I'm going to meter, my camera's right where you guys are, if I've got a light behind me and I want to measure for this side of the face that's partly in shadow and partly lit, I will meter in that way so that the dome is receiving light on one side, and that will give me the correct exposure for here. The backlit side of my face that is facing away from the light would go dark in the shadow. A little bit subjective, and we're going to cover that in the future, but good question. Someone asked about using, actually a couple of you asked about using the color checker with Apple's Aperture program. And the answer to that is not yet. That's actually a kind of a battle going on with Adobe and everyone else. Adobe has adopted what's called the DNG standard. They're trying to kind of use their weight to get everybody else to adapt and adopt it, but it hasn't happened yet. And only programs that use the DNG standard for their profiling behind the scenes will work with the color checker's custom profiles. So the answer right now is no. We have to see if people start adopting DNG or if it ends up going away. Someone asked about, again, the meter facing when you're doing a landscape shot. In general, I will do the same thing. And it's going to depend on the time of day. Generally, I'll just hold the meter out like this so that I'm getting a directionality of the sun, again, onto this three-dimensional meter. However, funny that you asked this. Next week, I'm going out and doing a video shoot in some cool locations, and we're going to actually put this combination to work on a landscape shoot, and I'll go over all that kind of stuff in detail. Let's see. Oh, someone asked about the other Sekonic targets. There is a color exposure target 1 and 2 that are somewhat pricey. I think they're about $149, and they really have that one single purpose, and it's for calibration. Why do you want that over this? Well, they are a little more precise. They're going to do a little bit better job of calibrating the meter to the camera. However, the beauty of being able to use the Passport now is this isn't the single purpose. It's not only going to allow you to do the calibration, but you have all the benefits of the Passport custom color calibration that go along with the software, which you're going to see. Oh, and by the way, everything that I'm doing with the 478 meter that I'm using today, if you have a 758, everything I'm saying applies. It works exactly the same way. You could just as easily do this with a 758. Unfortunately, someone asked, can you use the DTS software with the 358? And the answer to that is no. Only the 478 and the 758 can take advantage of the calibrations. Another question was, can you use this for shooting video with a Canon 5D Mark III? And the answer to that also is yes, and there's also a webinar coming up on that in a couple of weeks where I did exactly that with these gray cards, and we recently shot a video that we're going to cover in detail, and I used the Sony Alpha 99 for that, and I created my custom white balances with this and also used it for color profiling my monitor. So that will also come into play. Let's see. Someone asked, how do you do custom white balance before beginning the calibration process? It's a little bit different on every camera, but in general, what it simply means is you take a picture of the white balance target. Just take a picture of this. It doesn't need to fill the entire frame. It just generally needs to fill either the center focusing circle or your focusing dots. So in the scene that you're going to be in, what I do is I simply hold it at arm's length and take a picture of it. Or if you have a stand, you can do that. But it's really that simple. Take a shot of it, make sure it's exposed correctly, and then in your software's custom white balance menu, choose this image. In some cameras, you shoot the image first and then tell it to use it. In others, you say, I want to create a custom white balance, and it says, okay, take a picture of the white balance target. Just depends on the camera as to what the order is. Let's see. Someone asked if you have an original color checker, what target would you use for the incident or reflective measurement, meaning which gray? Generally, and the mini color checker is exactly the same as the big full-size color checker, generally you're going to use about the fourth one in. It's actually a slightly different gray than this one. It's a couple of points off, but it's pretty close, and it will work as far as getting those readings done. So in that case, you have a full-size color checker rather than a mini or a Passport, use the fourth one in. Let's see. Now, someone asked about getting correct exposure and white balance with the 478. Well, what we're doing first is we're taking the reading as the meter comes out of the box. And that's kind of our baseline. Then when we combine it with the target that's going to be put in the software, it's going to then calibrate exactly what the camera thinks perfect exposure and middle gray are. So actually it's a good time to move on to that. And this will probably answer some more of your questions. Let's see how to put them to work, first by creating an exposure profile in the DTS software. Take a look. Now that we've produced our 3 JPEG files with the 3 different exposures of the color checker passport target, let's fire up the data transfer software, or DTS. Now the Sekonic.478 meter is connected right now through its USB port. And let me just go ahead and fire it up. And as soon as I start it up, it comes in and it tells us what profiles are currently loaded into the meter. So what we're going to do is create a new profile. And we're going to use the quick mode, which is very simple to use. You just got to follow a couple steps. You're given a choice between the exposure profile target 1 and profile target 2 and the color checker target, which is what we've used for this particular test. Now, if you remember when we took our reading with both incident and reflected, we need to put those numbers in. So again, we were at 400 ISO, so we dial that in. Our shutter speed was a 30th of a second. And for our incident reading, we were at f8 and 1/10 of a stop. For our reflected reading, again, the same, 30th of a second, f8, and we were at 2/10 of a stop. Then you click on Next, and it's a little bit, I admit, it's a little bit obscure as to what's going on here. This is where you need to navigate to tell it where's the folder with those 3 JPEGs. So let's go ahead and move to that folder. If you remember, I had put those in my images folder in a folder called DTS so that they'd be easy to find. When you get there, then you just open the entire folder, as you can see here. I just click open. And here's our 3 JPEGs of the color checker target. And I'll just click on the first one, the second one, and the third. The reason you do this clicking is if there is multiple images in the folder or other JPEGs, they're also going to show up. So then again, I can click Next. And it tells us to click on one of the images and it will show it to us in a larger size. What we need to do is tell it where the corners of the target are. So we click on the little crosshairs here and we just tell the software the 4 corners so that it can easily find exactly where the target is to do its measurement. And since we did this on a tripod, once we do one, it will automatically line up on the other 2. So as we click on the next one, you see it's already done it. And on the third. And by the way, if you want to check a little closer, there is a preview brightness slider here so that you could double check to see on your very underexposed shot that the target is still lined up. But again, since everything was mounted, no problems there. This would be more of a problem if you were hand holding the camera when you took your shots. The next step is click on the next button, and what the software is going to do is calculate the tonal range of the camera. So let's take a look and see what it comes up with. And we're given with a lot of information right here. So we can see from all these numbers on the bottom, dynamic range for this particular shot at 400 ISO, we got 6.7 EVs, or basically 6.7 stops. Now there are these clipping point lines which we're going to adjust in a little bit. But basically what it's telling us is that with our dynamic range playing it safe, going up to 245 out of 255 and down to 20 out of 0, that we have from our midtone, which is set at 118, safely 3.5 stops up and 3.2 stops down is our safe tonal range for this camera. So then I can click on Save, give it a name, and I'm going to call it Sony A99 400 ISO. And I'm going to call it Tungsten 2. Just give it all the information so I know the conditions where this was set. So now we have this in here, and what I can do before loading it into the meter is edit the profile. And what I want to do is change the exposure range. I find the clipping points to be a little bit too safe. I'd like to have a little more closer to the edge. So let's go ahead and dial it in. Here is our profile we just created. Our ISO sensitivity was 400, and here's our graph. Let's expand that out to full screen. And what we can do right now is we can tell it, we want to expand the dynamic range a little closer to the edges. So 245 is 10 points in from our 255 possibility. I'm going to put a little closer to the edge. I'm going to make it 250. And my clipping point, which is kind of the warning area that you're getting close to the edge, again, 230 to me is very conservative. So I'm going to come up to 245 on that. And then conversely, on my dynamic range on my shadows, I'm going to go down to 10. And I'm going to make my clipping point 20. Now if we take a look, we see the dynamic range of the camera really, even still with a little bit of safety margin both in the shadows and the highlights, is 8.4 stops here. And we've got 4 stops up from our midtone and 4.3 stops down from our midtone so that we're safe. Even with our clipping levels, we see 3.5 up and minus 3.2 down. So what that means is when we're doing our calculations to place our highlights right at the edge, in this particular camera, I can take a highlight reading, know that I can open up 3.5 stops from that, and that will put those highlights right on the right, and we'll demonstrate that later. So I'll click on back and tell it to go ahead and overwrite that. And now what I can do is take this profile that we've just adapted, I'm going to put it in space 3, and tell it to transfer that to the light meter. And now the profiles are in the light meter, and what we've just added is the 400 ISO tungsten setting into space number 3. We can now disconnect and we'll be able to take a look directly at the meter and load that profile in. All right, I hope that made some things clearer. Again, I just want to reiterate, if you don't have one of the spot metering attachments for the meter, what you do is when you go into the software, just put the same values for the incident and the reflective reading. Although you would miss out on this really cool little pouch, so you might want to get one anyway. A couple other interesting questions that are applicable now. Someone asked, does the calibration depend on the lens? And do you need to perform a calibration for each lens being used? That's a good question. I haven't tried it to that point. The lenses that I'm using really didn't vary that much. But maybe if you have something really long, you might get a slightly different result, or something really wide. Again, I haven't tried that. You see, it doesn't take long. Just take a couple of different exposures and notate them. You can create profile for each lens combination as well and see if you get enough of a difference that you feel you want to incorporate that. And taking that one step further, someone said, or someone asked rather, what if you've got multiple camera bodies? Then you do the process for each body. You might have noticed in the software, you can create lots of profiles, and the meter itself can have, I believe, 10 loaded at any one time that you can access. So if you're switching cameras, or even ISOs, someone asked about ISOs, is the camera's internal meter or light recording ability going to change as the ISO changes? I've done up to 800 ISO on my camera, and I haven't really seen a change. But if you go very high ISO, I'm going to guess you're probably going to lose a little bit of dynamic range. I personally don't shoot high ISO, but I will be next week. On this landscape shoot again, I will try that. I'm going to be doing some star trail shooting, so I will be up around 6400 ISO. So I'll get back to you at the next webinar when we take all this out in the field and use it, and I'll let you know if I see a big difference in that dynamic range. Someone asked about, can you use these profiles as internal profiles in a Canon camera so that you could shoot a JPEG and have the profile apply internally? And the answer to that is no. This has to all be done post in software, and it needs to be done with a raw file, not a JPEG. So someone asked, is this meant for post-correction and application? It's actually the exposure, the profile for the color checker passport is for post. The exposure profile is for before, because again what we're doing is we're teaching the meter how the camera sees light. By creating this exposure profile, the meter now understands what your specific camera, even lens combination, thinks middle gray is. And now it also knows the dynamic range of the camera sensor. Now, as I mentioned, the camera's sensors are different. What I did was I created an exposure for my Sony Alpha 99. I also took my wife's Canon 7D, and profiled them both. When I loaded the profiles into the meter and took a reading of the same exact light, in fact, I did it here in the studio, I just took a measurement from the same spot with each profile loaded in, and the readings were a half a stop apart. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, one camera was better than the other, but they're different. So by doing this calibration, the meter now knows exactly what that camera thinks is that middle, and that's going to give me the absolute best exposure. Oh, somebody asked about accessing profiles in the meter. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to show you that right on the meter. Let me fire it up here. And I'm going to ask Rick to zoom in just a second. It's really very easy to do. So Rick, if you kind of zoom in here onto the meter. All right, so what I'm going to do is hit the menu button, and you can see number 4 says Set Profile. And I had loaded the profiles in from the software. My top one is my Sony Alpha 99. I put that in, and that is now loaded in. So now when I take a meter reading, actually, you can stay zoomed in on here. You see I've got 5, 6, and 2/10, and that is specific to the Sony Alpha 99. So what I can do now is I can set this as my mid-tone. So I'll hit the little tool button and click on mid-tone set from current measurement. I just set that, and look what's happened to the bottom of the display now. There's kind of this grid here where I've got green, some yellow on either end, and red. What that's showing me is where is the dynamic range of the camera and what are my safe exposures. Now we just set 5, 6, and 2/10 as our mid-tone. So Rick, if you'd back off for a second. So if I'm in a studio and I want to take different readings around, let's say I want to take the shadow side of my model, and I can say I get f4 and 7/10. I want to come over to maybe a highlight, take one up here, I get f8. Maybe a deep shadow, I want to take one way back here, and I get 2/8. And let me take one more, I'll take it kind of down here, and I get 4 and 9/10. Now what you do on each of these is there's a button on the side that will load those into memory. So take your reading, this is my mid reading, take your bright reading, put it into memory, take one up here, put it into memory, take your shadow one, put it into memory, and I'll take another one down here and put it into memory. And then what you can see, again, I'll ask Rick to zoom in. I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see it, but if you look in the green, now there's a little series of triangles, little pyramids, that are showing where each of those readings was. If anything was beyond the camera's dynamic range, it would tell you that because one of the arrows would be maybe in the red. In fact, let me go right up against the light and see if maybe I can do that. I'm going to put it right up here, right against the light, take a reading, still within range. A good thing and a problem with trying to demonstrate this is, one thing I learned about the Alpha 99 is it's got almost 9 stops of dynamic range, so it's really difficult to shoot something beyond the range when you're in studio. Easier to do it outside. One more, let me just come right up here against our big light. f11.4, I still couldn't get something, but anyway, Rick, if you'd zoom in again, you can see I've got a few more of these little triangle marks. When we do the landscape shoot out in the field, I'm sure we'll have enough tonal range where we'll be able to have some readings that are going to maybe be beyond. What this allows you to do, and again I'll explain this in detail in the next webinar, is you can then figure out what your furthest right spot is. So you can put your highlights right to the right and get your best exposure without clipping those highlights. So that's what we're going to do out in the field. And if you have the spot meter when you're doing that, I'll show how to do that. You'll put the spot meter on, and I'll take a reading off the brightest thing, which will typically be some clouds. I will put that right on the right, and this will tell me where to put that measurement so that I get the perfect exposure, yet have my highlights right to the right. And that's the whole beauty of it. It allows you to get your shot right the first time. So let's move on to the Passport a little more. I mentioned I've been using the Passport since it came out. I can't imagine doing shoots without it. Again, it allows you to create custom camera profiles for use in the Adobe Creative Suite with your RAW captures. Now, if you haven't seen this done before, and we'll include this in the follow-up email, I recommend you go on to xrightphoto.com and go look under Learning under the webinars, and there's a webinar archive there. If you're really interested in the extreme details of this, I did a webinar called Raw Color Power, and it goes through all the details of how to create profiles and how to apply them in both Lightroom and in Photoshop. Now, I have a shorter version that you can see right now, and again, the process is a little different in Lightroom and in Photoshop, but let's take a look. Let me just see, before we move on, if there are any other questions. Let's see. Okay, someone asked about this is a good question, about using the spot meter attachment. What is the difference between 1 to 5 to 10 degrees, and how do you decide which version to buy? Good question. You want to have something that's fairly tight. If you use a spot meter in your camera, the spot metering in your camera is going to depend greatly on the lens. If you have a fairly long lens, it's going to be a fairly tight reading, which is going to allow you to pinpoint into something like a cloud. If you're using a wider angle lens, then that spot reading becomes a much bigger area, and it's very difficult to get an accurate reading of what that highlight is. So the smaller the degree, the better. That's the simple answer there. All right, some more questions we'll answer after we see how to do the profile. Let's take a look first at how to create a profile in Adobe Lightroom. This is in 4, so take a look. Now I'm ready to create my custom camera profile using the perfectly exposed shot that we took of the color checker target. And this is a very simple process, and you can do this both in Lightroom and in Photoshop. Let's do it in Lightroom first. Now in Lightroom, when you install the software that comes with the color checker passport, a new option will appear under File, Export with Preset, and you'll see one called Color Checker Passport. At this point, just give it a name. I'm going to call it Sony A99 and Tungsten, since these were off of our studio lights. If I could only type. Click on Save, and that's as complicated as it is to actually create a profile. What the software is going to do is it'll go in automatically and find the target for us. It will go ahead and generate the profile, and when it's done, we'll get a message that says Lightroom needs to be restarted for the profile to take effect. And that's because Lightroom doesn't constantly update external files. When we go into Adobe Camera Raw, it will actually show up immediately after we do it. So this will just take, usually takes about 30-40 seconds or so. When it's done, it will tell us Lightroom needs to be restarted, and then our custom camera profile will be ready for use. Okay, and there's that message that the profile has been generated, and we have to restart Lightroom to activate the profile. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so we've restarted Lightroom, and now when we go into the Develop module, we'll see that our new profile is there waiting for us. So let's go to Develop. And profiles live under Camera Calibration, which is in the Develop module down in the bottom. And you'll see the default profile is the Adobe Standard. If we click on here, however, we'll see our custom profiles. The ones that start with the word Sony are ones that I've already created. So here's our Alpha 99 Tungsten. So let's click on that and see what happens. And if you take a look, it was fairly dramatic. Let's zoom in a little bit. Let's make this target full color. Take a look at the blues and the purple and pink here. Watch what happens as the difference between the standard profile and when we apply our custom profile. You see all those colors pop back into place. And this is going to give us a much more accurate and pleasing rendition of the color with this camera. So now combined with our custom white balance and our custom camera profile, we know that our files will have the best starting point for any color edits. All right, a couple more metering questions before I get back into the passport, just to get these out of the way. Someone asked about dome in, dome out, and I get that question frequently, meaning the little thing which is called a lumisphere, where it can be retracted into the body. When would you do this versus out? Generally, if I'm a landscape shooter, it's pretty much always going to remain out because I'm dealing generally with sunlight. Where I'm going to put the dome in is in a studio shoot, and we're going to go over this again soon as well, not in this webinar. What dome in allows you to do is to measure the light that is more directional. So if I'm creating light ratios on a portrait, then it's important that I have dome in. So what I can then do is take a reading. Let's say I'm dealing with studio strobes. I'll take a reading of this light, then come over here and take a reading of that light. And I want the dome in because I don't want the reading to be polluted by other lights in the studio. Then when I'm finally done, I'll put the dome back out and take a reading from here back to the camera. That will give me my middle reading. But by having the dome in, I can then create my lighting ratios. Again, a subject for another day, which is coming up soon, but good question. Someone asked if there's no variation between identical sensors, meaning what if you've got two bodies? You have two Alpha 99s or two Canon Mark IIIs. You don't know that. It depends kind of on manufacturing dates sometimes. I don't expect there to be a huge variation, but you might. So really the way to find out is just to create a profile for each one, load them in, load the profile in from one of the cameras, take a reading under some continuous light, maybe just outside in the sun, take your reading, switch the profile, take a reading again. As long as a cloud hasn't come up in the sun, you can see if there's any difference in the reading. You might be surprised. It might be a little bit of a difference. Could be a couple of tenths. I've seen them as much as a half a stop apart. So you do want to do that. And that's the beauty of doing the profiles. Someone asked about if you're metering something like you're shooting sports, not a static object, somebody coming at you. Good question, and it depends on what is the light source. If you're out in the sun, well, again, the sun's 96 million miles away. If the athlete's 100 feet away or 5 feet away, the light hitting them is the same. Where it comes in, where it changes is in direction. If all of a sudden somebody was front lit and they're becoming backlit. In that case, what I would do is I would meter myself facing the same way that the athlete's facing. So for example, if I'm on a track or a football field and someone's running this way, what I'll do is I'll take my reading with myself facing the same way they are, and that's the reading I put into the camera. But good question. Metering isn't just a science. There's a little bit of art to it as well. But once you get used to it, once you start using these, you can't imagine not using it. Let's see. Oh, so somebody asked a question. All right, I have my meter set in tenths, which I do in the studio and for the calibration. However, after that, when I'm out in the field, what I do is I set my meter to be in thirds of a stop, and that is a setting right on the camera. Actually, Rick, if you'd zoom in again, I'll show everybody where that is. So if I hit the menu button and go to custom settings, you can see the first one is increments of time and aperture. And you see I have it set for one stop, which means it will read in tenths. If I want it to match the readings on my camera, I can set it to a third of a stop and hit OK, and then menu back out. And then what happens is my aperture readings will match the steps that my camera has. Tenth is handy when you're setting up lights. Out in the field, thirds is going to be fine. It's going to match your camera better. Good questions, though. Okay, back to the Passport. So you've seen a calibration, a color calibration created with the Passport in Lightroom. I just want to make it clear how valuable that is. If you're a wedding shooter and you've got multiple cameras, say you have 2 shooters, maybe 3 shooters, and they're using different camera models, maybe even different camera brands. If you create a profile for each of those cameras under the different lighting conditions they're going to run into, since they now have the same standards, the same reds, greens, and blues, etc., to create that profile from, their color response, once that profile is applied, is going to match. There's nothing uglier than having a wedding album with a bunch of portraits and the skin tone on each shot is a little different because it was shot with a different camera. By creating a profile, that goes away. Same thing for mixed lighting. Let's say you got a mix of tungsten and daylight or strobe and fluorescence. If you have that, just take a shot of this target, create a profile for it, and apply it, and all your colors are going to snap into place, and everybody's camera that's using it, as long as you have one of these, they'll match. A couple other questions. Somebody asked if the RGB values are posted anywhere for the Passport. They are. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. They are on one of the X-Rite sites. In our follow-up, we'll have an email there. Send me a note, and in the meantime, I'll look up to see exactly where those values are, but I have seen them. And I think it was just on the full-size color checker. Someone asked about using dual illuminant profiles, which you're going to see in just a second. I'm not actually going to do one. What a dual illuminant profile is when you take a picture of the color checker under different light sources. So you'll take one, and say, for example, one under tungsten, one under daylight, or one under strobe, one under fluorescent. And what it does is it takes both of those images and it interpolates between the different color temperatures where the profile would work based on the color temperature. It's better than not having anything at all. Me personally, I like to create a profile for each different lighting condition I run into. Daylight, shade, tungsten, fluorescent, and then any kind of mixed lighting. Now once I create a daylight profile for my camera, I don't ever have to create that again. Sunlight is continuous spectrum light, so it is what it is. Same thing with my strobes, both my speed lights and my studio strobes. Once I've created a profile for them, they're done. What changes through the course of the day or with the power of your lights is the color temperature, your white balance, not the profile. The profile has to do with the spectrum of light. So I probably have 5 or 6 profiles for each of my cameras, and then the only time I'll create a new one is if I enter some kind of really odd mixed lighting. Maybe it's 2 or 3 different light sources, then I'll do one for that. Again, if you want to hear more about that, go on to xrightphoto.com under the webinar archives, and that stuff is there. Someone asked about the difference between the 478D and 478DR models. Very simple. The DR means radio. It's got the Pocket Wizard trigger built into it so that I can fire my lights from here. If you don't have that feature in the meter has a waiting mode where I can tell it I'm going to fire a flash. You just hit the reading button. It'll wait for 90 seconds to see a flash, and then you can fire your flashes from the light, from a Pocket Wizard, from your camera, however you're doing it, and then the meter will read that. Excellent question, guys, though. Let's see. Yes, somebody asked, where are the color checker passports with the gray card? That is brand new, and right now it's only included with the bundle. Stay tuned. We'll see if it comes out as a separate item. Right now, it's just with the bundle with the 478. Let's see. Somebody asked, is shade lighting outdoor different than indoor? Yes, it is. Shade lighting outdoor, again, is going to be, well, it depends on what the light source is. If you're outside in the sun, shade lighting is going to change depending on what's causing the shade. Is it a cloud? Is it coming through trees? What is it reflecting off of? And that can all change the spectrum of the light hitting your subject. Same thing with indoor. Where's the light coming from? What are the colors of the walls that are bouncing? What things are absorbing certain spectra of light? So that's why it's always handy to have a passport around when you enter a new lighting situation. Now, you may not feel the need to create a profile everywhere you go, but just simply take a shot. I keep this with me wherever I go. It just fits in my pocket. I'll just either put it on some object or hold it out in front, take a quick picture. Then I'm assured that if I need to, I'll have perfect color adjustments regardless of what light situation I'm under. Okay. Oh, and yes, and someone asked about, once you make a profile, it seems it needs to be white balanced. Yes, let me make that clear. The profile and the white balance are 2 pieces of the same system. They're the same puzzle. You need both of them. So when you create your profile, the profile is how colors relate to each other. Where are they in space to each other? The white balance is setting a neutral. So you do need to do both. So every time you create a profile, if you didn't custom white balance in camera, then you'll want to white balance off of one of the neutral targets on the passport, which would be really anything on the bottom row. Me personally, I usually use the second or third target in for doing my white balance in software. And again, I cover that all in detail on the Raw Color Power webinar on xrightphoto.com. So let's continue on. We'll take some more questions a little bit. What if you don't have Lightroom? If you're a photographer, you really should have Lightroom. But if you don't, maybe you just have Photoshop, maybe you have Elements. In that case, you're going to be using Adobe Camera Raw, which is a little bit different process to create the profile. So let's watch creating a profile using Adobe Camera Raw.
So what we're going to do this time is we're going to create a custom profile using Adobe CS6 and Adobe Camera Raw. So it's a little bit different process than we do it in Lightroom, so let's go through that. So what I'm going to do is just click on Open a File, and I'm going to navigate to our DTS folder, go to the Originals, and open up our target. And you can see it opens up in Adobe Camera Raw. The little triangle there just means that it's still rendering, so it just means give it a second. And here's our file, just like we saw in Lightroom. Now, there's one extra step we need to do when we're creating a custom profile using Adobe Camera Raw, and that's we do need to save the picture of the target itself as a DNG file. So let's go ahead and do that. It's very simple. Just down on the bottom lower left, click on Save Image and DNG, and what we're going to do is call this, we'll call it Alpha 99 Tungsten Target. and we'll save it in the same location. So I click on save, and that's all we had to do. And what it's done is it's saved that image to that folder as a DNG. Now we create a profile in Adobe Camera Raw with a little application that comes along with the passport called Color Checker Passport. So we click on that, and we're going to get a screen that's going to take us through a process that was very similar to what we just saw in Lightroom. So what it tells us to do is drag and drop a DNG image here. Now since my screen's already a little cluttered, I'm just going to go to File, Add Image, and navigate to back where we were. And here's our tungsten target as a DNG file. So I click Open, and what the software is going to do is it's going to look at the image and it's going to go find those corners all by itself. Let's just take a few seconds. How long this takes is going to depend on one, how big the original raw file is. This happens to be off of a 24 megapixel camera, and maybe how much else is going on in the image. Okay, so here we see the software has found the target, it's zoomed in on the image, and it's already placed the corner points in the correct spot. We can see that from these green squares here, this is where the software is going to take its samples for creating the profile. In fact, if you back off, if I click on the zoom and hold in or Alt Option, you can see we can back off and we can see the rest of the image actually still is there. So it's found the target just fine. We didn't need any help from us. Now we simply click on Create Profile. I'll call it Alpha 99 from Adobe Camera Raw. And I'll call this tungsten just to let us know that that is a tungsten profile, because you need to have a profile for each different type of light source. I'll have one for tungsten, I'll have one for flash, I'll have one for daylight, and then for mixed lighting situations. Well, you can see that was pretty quick, and it says the profile has been created successfully. Some applications may need to be restarted, and what they're talking about is Lightroom. Any profile you create in here will be recognized by Lightroom. Any profile you create in Lightroom will automatically be recognized by Adobe Camera Raw. So we're done here. We can just click on Quit, and even though we just have our one image up, let's go ahead and take a look at the profiles. And they live in Adobe Camera Raw under this little icon of a camera. So we click on Camera Calibration, and again we have the Adobe Standard. Now when we click on this drop-down menu, you'll see we have, here's the one we just created. You also see the one that we created from Lightroom is already here as well. So let's go ahead and apply that. And again, we see that same color shift. In this case, particularly in these blues, this kind of eggplant color and this deep pink have changed a lot compared to the very safe Adobe Standard. By creating a custom profile and applying it, we get a much truer depiction of how our eyes see the color, and it gives us a much better starting point to do our edits. Just like when we were in Lightroom, if we had opened up a whole bunch of images here, we could select them all and sync them so that they would all then take this profile and they would all have the same exact starting port for custom white balance and for custom camera profile. And again, that's going to give you the best color starting position you can get.
Okay, we're back. Lots of questions. Wow, you've got our chat room people really typing furiously, but thank you for that, because we appreciate that. That's what it's there for. A couple more questions about the passport. Someone asked, do the color patches on the passport fade with time? Now, these are kind of more like a paint than printed. They are pretty dense and heavy, but yes, like anything that's with color, UV light is eventually going to cause it to fade. However, the thing does have a solid case that is pretty light tight. So if you keep the thing closed when you're not using it, it's going to last for a while. If you put it like this on the dashboard of your car on a summer's August day at noon, then no, it's going to fade quickly. So if you protect it, I have a couple of these I've been using for a couple of years, and they're just fine. Someone asks, what if I have a passport made by the other company? Will it work the same way? I just saw that for the first time a couple weeks ago. I haven't had a chance to test it, so I really can't talk about it. One of these days I will get around to seeing what happens. A couple of you are shooting with digital backs. Someone mentioned Phase 1 P45. Someone else mentioned Hasselblad. Now, the softwares that are specifically for those cameras don't have a way to access the passport's profiles. I do shoot some cameras that use Capture One. I shoot some Mamiya leaf backs, and what I end up doing is I generally bypass their software and I come right into Lightroom if I want to use that profile. It really seems to work best for me. And going to that, someone says, why use Lightroom if you already have CS6? Photoshop, what's the advantage? Oh, I could go a whole day about that, but I use them both. And I think you Photoshop folks, if you start using Lightroom, you're going to see what it does really well. Lightroom is two things. One, it's basically a giant Adobe Camera Raw. It does everything Adobe Camera Raw does, but it does it much easier. The tools are much easier to access. It also integrates very well with Photoshop. And I can take an image and send it into Photoshop. If I need that pixel-based layer kind of editing, just hit Save in Photoshop and it dumps it back into Lightroom. The beauty of that, again, is Lightroom also becomes an image database. So it's a way to organize your images. You can have multiple versions of each image, and they're really virtual copies, so that you can try out different things, but you always have your raw file, and they stay raw until you export them out in Lightroom into somewhere else. So if you're not using Lightroom and you're a Photoshop user, I highly recommend taking a look at it. You can download it for free and use it for 30 days. Give it a shot. Someone mentioned, do I have to use a DNG file? I was told that wasn't necessary. The only time you have to create a DNG file is if you don't have Lightroom and you're using the Color Checker Passport software. You do need to take your shot of the color checker, and this is the only shot you need to do this to, and save that one shot as a DNG file from Adobe Camera Raw like you saw in the demo. After that, no more DNG. That's the only time you need to do it. You can then apply that DNG profile to all of your raw files. They can stay in their raw state, no need to change them. Someone else, where are the profiles created and stored? Oh, you don't want to know, because that's one of the things. Yes, I can tell you. If you send me a note, I'll tell you exactly where they are. But just understand that profiles, when you start seeing where they are, they're in the right place. If you start messing with them, it's going to be a problem. There is a utility for the profiles that X-Rite offers that allows you to turn them on and off. You can also delete them. You can copy them if you want to give them to someone else. They are in the Adobe folder. Send me a note. I'll give you the link. Let's see. Anything else? Oh, someone asked, can you set a preference in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw to use the profiles you have set up automatically instead of the Adobe profiles? Yes, you can. That goes into presets. You can create a preset. And what we do in Studio when we're doing a portrait session is we'll create a profile for the lights. We'll do our white balance. We might even do an adjustment if we think that because of the set, we might want to add a little warmth to skin or something like that. We'll make those adjustments and create a preset in Lightroom. Subject for another day, but you can look that up. You just Google creating presets in Lightroom. And then what happens is every image as it comes into Lightroom will automatically get all of the features and adjustments you've made automatically applied to it. And again, the beauty is when they're raw files, you can always change them. They're assigned to the image, but they don't ever get built in until you export it as another file type. Let's see, anything else? Okay, so the person wanted to know where the profiles are stored. We want to delete some. Again, there is a utility that will allow you to do this. If you want to delete them manually, again, send me a note and I'll tell you where they are. They're not that hidden. All right. Wow, I can't believe we've run out of time. We expected this to be a short webinar, and I'm just coming up short of an hour. So let me sum up real quick, and I'll tell you about next webinar. So the DTS software, with it and with the Passport, you now have the ability to create an exposure profile using the Passport where you don't have to buy the Exposure Target 2. Yes, the Exposure Target 2 is more precise, but with the Passport, you get something that can create an exposure profile, and you get all the perfect color from creating those custom camera profiles with both Lightroom and Photoshop. If you already own one of the parts, you can buy the other one and you'll have all the tools. It will change the quality of your photography overnight. If you're not using a meter, I'm very sad. You got to have a meter. Anytime that you want really precise exposure, you don't want to be chimping. You want to have it set and know your exposure is right, and then you can concentrate on composition. You can concentrate on your client and know that your exposures are going to be perfect. So if you're not doing it, I highly recommend you look into it. Really, what are you waiting for? If you don't have either of these, get the package. In the follow-up email, I understand what's going to be included is a $50 rebate if you purchase the bundle, the 478 and the Passport. I am sorry to say that it's only available in the US. Sorry about that. But it just makes it that much easier to do. And again, you can get the 478D or the DR. Again, the DR has the Pocket Wizard transmitter in it. If you're not using Pocket Wizards or Studio Lights, then just get yourself the D. So what's coming up? All right, we're going to do a follow-up email. Included in that will be a link to today's recording. It will also have a survey. I know you guys a lot of you are familiar with the surveys. It's just a real quick, if you can answer the questions for us, it gives me the feedback as to what other stuff you guys want to hear about. We'll also have a link to, or a note about upcoming webinars. And as I mentioned, the end of next week, I'm going out and shooting in Death Valley, and I'm going to put these tools to work out in the field, and I'll go over some metering details about landscape photography, how to use it with the Passport, and then how to apply all those edits. I'll do presets as well when we come into Lightroom and Photoshop. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for the great questions. Always appreciate them, and I look forward to seeing you on the line again soon. So until then, everybody have a great rest of the week and be well. Bye-bye.